Willkommen, bienvenue, welcome to Eddie's Encyclopedia of Musicals. I am Eddie, and today I want to talk about the musical Funny Girl. First, I'm going to talk about the history of the show itself, and then I'm going to break down the show, primarily through an analysis of its lyrics. This means I'm going to be talking a lot about linguistic stuff, which I find fascinating. Hopefully you will find it interesting too. But that is my area of expertise, and so I'm going to talk a lot about that. But let's start with the history. Funny Girl is a very famous musical from the 1960s. It debuted in 1964 on Broadway, and it originally starred Barbra Streisand. It's one of those star vehicle kinds of shows where the show itself is just okay, but it is written around the lead in such a way that it just really shows them off. It's one of those shows that can only be as good as its lead performer. So you can imagine when the lead performer is Barbra Streisand, the show really took off. And it has an iconic score. People who have never even heard of the musical know some of these songs, like People, and especially Don't Rain on My Parade. Funny Girl, like I said, originally starred Barbra Streisand. I read somewhere that after her contract was signed, the project was shelved for a bit, and that by the time they pulled it out again, she had broken out into this huge stardom, and she was able to completely renegotiate her contract for all kinds of perks because of that. I don't remember where I read that, though. Anyway, Funny Girl was so popular and so specifically star-oriented, with possibly the greatest star in the original production. I think this is why it never got revived after the original production. Anyone you put in the lead is doomed to be compared to Streisand, whose performance was so incredible and iconic. In case you haven't noticed, Streisand may be my favorite Broadway singer, even though she hasn't done very much on Broadway. But, from her Broadway stuff to her movie musicals to her singing career, just a fantastic voice. Fast forward approximately 60 years, and Funny Girl finally got its revival on Broadway. If you've been paying any attention if you've been paying any attention at all to Broadway news in the last few years, you know that Funny Girl has been a major source of drama. Like I said, its lead is bound to be compared to Streisand, especially since no other major productions have happened since in the US. Besides, it's a show that really needs the star power to survive. It's just not a great show. The book is flimsy and the pacing is odd. But the score is good. It's just so centered around the character of Fanny Brice that it's hopeless without a phenomenal performer. In the revival, they cast Beanie Feldstein as Fanny Brice. Beanie, who is more known for her television roles, had most recently performed on Broadway in Hello, Dolly as Minnie Fay. So she's not the big name that Streisand was when Funny Girl originally opened. My only familiarity with Beanie's vocal performance is her rendition of Dancing Through Life at Miscast a few years ago. She has a nice voice, she does. But nothing in that performance suggested to me that she's this vocal powerhouse that you have to be in Funny Girl. And that's what the reviews all said, critical or otherwise. She just wasn't the right kind of star for this show needed. She didn't have the big name to sell tickets, and she wasn't developing it from her performance either. In fact, I saw so many posts online saying that the understudy Julie Benko, who would perform on Thursdays, was the person to see. In fact, Julie Benko is one of the only Broadway understudies whose name I know without actually having seen them perform. So apparently, Funny Girl ended up being her breakout role, but, it didn't work out so well for Beanie. And Beanie didn't stay in the role long, and the Funny Girl controversy continued. A long-held rumor was fulfilled, and Lea Michele took over the role of Fanny. She has a much bigger name and a much bigger voice than Beanie, and it worked. The show recouped its money. She literally turned a flop where they were practically giving tickets away to a certifiable hit. The ticket prices soared through the roof. I think I saw them go up to $500. It was crazy. Why is this controversial? Because Lea Michele has a reputation of, shall we say, being difficult to work with. A few years ago, several of her old castmates from Glee came out saying that she would do and say horrible, racist, and other horrible things. A lot of people were really put off by the idea of Lea returning to Broadway because of this. But once the casting announcement came out, everything changed. people swarmed to the August Wilson Theater. I just remember seeing the same people online calling Lea Michele out for her reputation and complaining about the idea of her being cast, then coming to the same forums asking when to make sure to see her. She got incredible reviews. It was just surreal to watch all of this. It just seemed like a lot of hypocrisy. But hey, if anyone knows how to uncancel themselves, it's Lea Michele. Now, I will say, I never heard a single thing coming back from backstage about Lea being difficult to work with during Funny Girl. If anything, I heard the opposite. So I'm going to give her the benefit of the doubt here, that she's grown up since Glee and has learned not to be a terrible human being. Whether she's had a change of heart or just learned how to hide it better, I don't know. Probably never will because I've never met her. I can just choose to hope that she's, in fact, changed. So the very sudden about-face on her reputation was weird, but at the end of the day, I never heard anything negative about working with her on Funny Girl, so I guess it worked out. Anyway, the show eventually launched a tour, and the controversy continues. They cast Katarina McCrimmon as Fanny Bryce, famously Jewish Fanny Bryce. Katarina McCrimmon is apparently not Jewish, and so a lot of people were up in arms over this kind of erasure. What's interesting about this is that when Funny Girl was in the very early stages of production, when they were looking for a writing team, the actress Mary Martin was attached to the project. She wanted Julie Stein and Stephen Sondheim to write the score, but Sondheim said no because Martin wasn't Jewish. He said the actress playing Fanny Bryce had to be Jewish. This is particularly interesting considering less than a decade before, Sondheim had written West Side Story, a musical about Puerto Ricans that starred very few Latina actors. Only one to my knowledge, which was Chita Rivera. And I know in the movie, I think there were only two Latina actors, one being, of course, Rita Moreno. Of course, West Side Story was Sondheim's first Broadway musical, and he didn't have nearly the pull he had later, which may have gone into the casting decisions. Regardless, lots of drama surrounding Funny Girl over the last few years. But let's get to the show itself. I saw the tour this last Sunday, which is why I wanted to make this episode now. First off, I had a blast. I thought it was a really fun show. The cast was excellent. But this is interesting because I don't like Funny Girl. This may have been apparent in how I've been talking about it. I've never liked it. The score is good, how can it not be? It was written by Julie Stein, who, as far as I'm concerned, never misses. No, it's not as good as Gypsy, but hey, Funny Girl has a rightfully iconic score. The book, written by Isabel Leonard, is flimsy and flawed, with pacing that makes an already kind of dull topic unbearably boring. The revival featured a revised book by Harvey Fierstein. I found his revision seemed to at least fix the pacing issues, because I did not notice those nearly as much as when I saw it Sunday. I'm assuming this is why I enjoyed the show as much as I did. That, or it's just the magic of live theater compared to seeing the movie, or the pro shot from the London production. The other writer of the show is Bob Merrill, the lyricist. I am otherwise unfamiliar with his stage works. Lyrics are a very important part of musicals to me. They're at the intersection of song and story. I generally enjoyed Merrill's work in this show. It felt like golden age musical theater writing. Because, it kind of was. But what do I even mean by that? The scansion is a big part of it. What is scansion? Scansion has to do with syllable stress. Aligning stressed syllables across lines, or having a particular stress pattern across syllables. Look at the lines, "If a girl isn't pretty like Miss Atlantic City," from the song "If a Girl Isn't Pretty." First off, there's an interesting thing going on with the syllables from the get-go. "If a girl isn't pretty" doesn't have the same syllable count as "like a Miss Atlantic City." But these two lines sound like they do when they're sung. Girl gets an extra beat in the music. That's just a nifty way that the music and the lyrics work together. It also makes me wonder whether the music was written before the lyrics for this song. Anyway, scansion. You may have learned a bit about this in your high school English classes when you studied Shakespeare. It's a pattern of syllable stress. For the purposes of this, we're going to treat girl as if it has two syllables because the music treats it that way. So we've got "if a girl isn't pretty like a Transatlantic city. Hopefully I'm emphasizing the difference between the two clear enough that you can hear it. It's trochaic, which means that the line starts with a stressed syllable, and then it alternates between stressed and unstressed syllables. Scansion is common in Golden Age musical theater lyrics, right? At words poetic, I'm so pathetic. From Cole Porter's You're the Top. Some enchanted evening, you may see a stranger. From Oscar Hammerstein's Some Enchanted Evening. Not every musical from the Golden Age had good scansion. Not every musical from the Golden Age had simple scansion. Some songs were all over the place in how the scansion works, hopping between iambic and trochaic and whatnot. Iambic and trochaic are the two most common stress patterns in lyrics and poetry, when there is a pattern. Iambic and trochaic are opposites of each other. Trochaic starts with a stress and then goes to a stressless syllable. Iambic starts unstressed and then goes to a stress. Both iambic and trochaic have a pattern that spans two syllables. This minimal unit captures the whole stress pattern. This minimal unit that captures the whole stress pattern is called a foot. You might recall that Shakespeare wrote in iambic pentameter. We know what iambic means now, unstressed, stressed. Pentameter refers to the number of feet in a line, the number of times the pattern of stresses is fully iterated in a line. Penta means 5 in Greek, so pentameter is 5 feet. 5 stresses. Bob Merrill wrote this song, If a Girl Isn't Pretty, in trochaic meter, though it varies in how long a line is throughout the song. So it isn't consistently trochaic tetrameter, even though the two lines that I talked about are trochaic tetrameter. Tetrameter. Tetra means 4 in Greek, so 4 feet or 4 stresses. You'll notice a lot of our terms for poetry and prosody stem from Greek, prosody being essentially the study of scansion and versification. This is really interesting, especially because Greek prosody was measured by vowel length and not stress. I say vowel length, I do not mean a versus a, which in English are both represented sometimes by the same letter, and that's called, a long a versus a short a. That's not what I mean. I mean literal vowel length, a versus ah. I slightly exaggerated the length, I think, to make sure you can hear it. Lots of languages, Greek, Latin, German, I think Arabic, and tons of Native American languages have this. English actually used to have this way back in the day, like Beowulf era. Anyway, where was I? Scansion. Scansion, okay. We talked about iambic versus trochaic, and how it's really common in Golden Age musicals to use scansion. Not essential, though. They might have said it was, but it's not. I can find you songs by, say, Irving Berlin that don't have a consistent scansion pattern throughout. But scansion was considered very important in Golden Age writing. A common complaint I hear about musical theater lyrics in the modern era is that they don't use scansion. I'm sure that's true for some lyricists, and I was going to find you an example or 3, but in looking, I actually found something cooler. Different types of meter, such as a dactylic, and also mixing of meters. First, what is dactylic? Same concept as iambic and trochaic. It's the pattern of stresses in a foot. But iambic is unstressed, stressed, and trochaic is stressed, unstressed. Those are the only 2 ways we can alternate a syllable or a foot with 2 syllables, right? Well, no. We can have 2 stresses. That's called spondaic meter, very common in Latin. Or we could have 2 unstressed syllables. That's pyrrhic meter. That last one I don't think is super common, especially when it refers to unstressed syllables rather than short ones. But I haven't explained what dactylic means yet. Poetic feet aren't limited to 2 syllables. 2-syllable feet are very common, especially in a language like English, but they aren't essential. We can have feet with 3 syllables, and indeed we do. Dactylic meter is a meter with a stressed syllable followed by 2 unstressed syllables. So it goes ba-da-da, 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 ba-da-da. Dactylic meter was actually super common in Greek poetry. Homer wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey in dactylic hexameter. Remember, dactylic is the pattern, hexameter means the number of times the pattern occurs in a line. Hexa means 6 in Greek, so you had 18 syllables per line, or 6 long vowels per line. Remember, Greek didn't measure poetry by stress like English, but rather by length. Anyway, I was looking up random modern musical theater songs to look for ones without any notable scansion. And I found an interesting amount of dactylic meter. Check this out. How to account for his rise to the top, from Lin-Manuel Miranda's Nonstop. We were so tiny, happy, and shiny, from Lawrence O'Keefe's Beautiful, from Heathers. Chalk it all up to experience, from Nell Benjamin's Legally Blonde. Some of these lines appear amid otherwise iambic or trochaic lyrics. I'm very curious now as to whether this is the case that modern musical theater has begun mixing prosodic patterns more than Golden Age lyrics. I'm sure if I kept to digging, I'd find modern songs with little to no scansion, but I thought this mixing of scansion was way more interesting than that, and something that I'm going to look into in the future. Anyway, to get back to Funny Girl, Bob Merrill seems to have used a lot of iambic and trochaic meter, which gives it a very Golden Age feel. And that makes sense. Funny Girl was written in the mid-60s, around the end of the Golden Age. And we can actually see how Funny Girl was from the end of the Golden Age in the rhymes. Just like Golden Age lyricists were outspokenly picky about their scansion, so were they about their rhymes. You had to use what are typically called perfect rhymes or true rhymes. I believe in the linguistics literature they're usually called perfect rhymes, so that's what I'm going to call them. What's a perfect rhyme? Well, it's a rhyme. We call a lot of things rhymes that don't actually meet the linguistic criteria of a rhyme. A perfect rhyme is the matching of words that does meet that criteria exactly. So what's the criteria? Okay. So a syllable has 3 segments in it. There's the vowel, which we linguists call the nucleus of the syllable, because like with cells, the nucleus is the most important part. The nucleus is actually the only part of the syllable that is required to be present for a syllable to exist. Like I said, the nucleus is the vowel. Usually, it gets really complicated sometimes, but it's almost always a vowel, especially in English, so we're just going to define it that way for now because that'll be easier for you guys to remember. We're not doing an analysis of musical theater in Berber or anything like that. So we'll just stick to nuclei or vowels. All the consonants within a syllable that come before that nucleus are part of what we call an onset. So the onset comes before the nucleus. It can contain just one consonant. It can contain 3 consonants. It doesn't have to contain any, in which case there is no onset. But it will only have consonants if it contains anything. Likewise, all consonants that come after the nucleus in the syllable are part of the coda. You may recognize that word from music, referring to the end of the piece. It's the Italian word for tail, I think, or end, essentially. The same idea as the onset. The coda doesn't have to exist at all, or it can contain one or more consonants. Only consonants, never vowels. Vowels are always in the nucleus. So we have three segments of a syllable: onsets, nuclei, and codas. This is how syllables are defined across languages. If a language has syllables, which most do, Japanese is one to look up for languages that aren't really syllable-based, and that gets really interesting, but anyway. For languages that have syllables are structured like how I've just mapped out. What's really cool, and this is one of my absolute favorite things, is that across languages, we create art, that is, poetry and lyrics, by matching different parts of the syllable. If you have 2 syllables and you match the onset, like cat and cape, you have alliteration. If you match the nuclei, you have assonance, like in cat and map. If you match the codas, you have consonants, like cat and bet. That one's not used so much in poetry in English. I believe some languages do care more about it. And even in English verse, it does add a certain repetition that can be really interesting. But that's all 3 segments, and none of those is a rhyme. So what's a rhyme? Well, if you match the nucleus all the way through the coda, that is a rhyme, like cat and rat. But what's really interesting is that rhyme actually transcends syllable structure. We can have 2-syllable rhymes, like rabbit and habit. There, we're matching everything from the initial nucleus to the final coda. That is how rhyme works. You start with a stressed nucleus, has to be stressed, and go through the end of the word or the phrase. And everything there has to match. It's not a rhyme, not a perfect rhyme at least, if the whole word matches. Like bat and bat, even though they're different words, right? Bat is an animal, or bat is a piece of baseball equipment. That's not a rhyme. That's called an identity. Some people refer to it as an identity rhyme, but technically, well, it doesn't really matter. It's an identity or an identity rhyme, however you wish to call it. The linguistic definition of a rhyme is a word or phrase where the stressed nucleus and everything after is matched exactly. That's what's called a perfect rhyme, or a true rhyme, by some. I would argue it's just a rhyme, because the existence of a true or perfect rhyme implies the existence of an imperfect or false rhyme, and I think that undermines what's actually happening. Yes, we use words like imperfect or false rhyme, or slant rhyme, or even lazy rhyme to describe these other instances of matching things. An imperfect rhyme is something like rabbit and rabid, right? The nucleus matches, the consonant after it matches, the unstressed nucleus after that matches, but the final codas are different. This is really interesting to me as a lyricist. As a lyricist, but as a linguist primarily. That we, as lyricists, poets, and audiences, accept this as a rhyme. This is actually something that I want to study in my future linguistic research. Anyway, we have perfect rhymes and we have imperfect rhymes, whether I like the terms or not. And in Golden Age musical theater, there was a huge emphasis on perfect rhymes. It was considered bad craft to use an imperfect rhyme. That changed in the 60s. Oh, that doesn't mean that everyone was on board. I can quote Stephen Sondheim and Tim Rice and plenty of other lyricists from the 1960s through the modern day who criticized the use of imperfect rhymes, even though many of them, maybe even all of them, were guilty of using them themselves. My point is, the fixation on perfect rhymes lessened in the 60s and is often attributed to the introduction of rock into musical theater. Genres like rock, pop, and rap have tons of imperfect rhymes. They're quite known for that. Funny Girl was written in the mid-60s, and guess what? It has imperfect rhymes. That same song I was talking about earlier, If a Girl Isn't Pretty, has an instance of rhyming hasn't with pageant. Pageant. Those don't rhyme. Not perfectly. This would have been a big no-no just a few years earlier, but we see the rules becoming more lax in the 60s, and Merrill pushing the envelope on what constituted a good rhyme, or at least an acceptable one. I think that's a good place to end my phonological rambling. I hope you learned something interesting here. If not about musicals, then about linguistics. I learned some interesting things myself and have new ideas for research projects, so I consider this podcast episode a win. Thank you for listening to Eddie's Encyclopedia of Musicals.